Welcome to the Leaders in Housing Counseling call. We're in the second call we are doing for September. It's been quite a month, and glad to have you all on the call. We're going to do a walkthrough on what's happening with federal funding, which has been a nerve-wracking nail-biter. So we'll spend a few minutes on that and where we're going and what we'll need to accomplish in the short term and the longer term. We'll spend most of the call on disaster issues, disaster-related issues, which is obviously very timely, but it's also a critical issue for the housing counseling community. More and more resources are being devoted in this area. Groups are doing powerful work in this area. HUD has devoted a lot of attention to it. There are lots of growth opportunities and obviously lots of challenges. And so we wanted to kind of bring people up to date, at least on the high points. You know, this is going to be a short program. We have less than an hour for it, so it won't be the full run, but wanting to alert people to issues and what they should be thinking about. And then we'll do a plug for joining NHRC. We've had a really great year in membership this year. We've grown dramatically and appreciate the support, but I understand there's still a couple agencies out there that haven't gotten around to joining, and we do need to get you in, so that'd be good. All right, with that note, let's move over to federal funding. So Matthew, so 2019 is the one that starts on October 1st of this year. So where are we at on 2019?
Yep. So won't go too far into the backstory, but just we've been scrambling recently, and folks have seen emails. Kind of the short version is that we heard probably going back a couple weeks now that there was a chance that the House and the Senate could be going to conference committee on the THUD bill, which was a bit odd because the House had never passed a THUD bill. The Senate had passed one, but won't go into the weeds on that, but we had heard that they could be doing a conference committee. So we kind of kicked into overdrive to do everything we could to we're still doing everything we can to try to make sure that they land on the House number, which is $56 million for housing counseling versus the Senate version, which is $45 million. So just kind of where things stand now, it's still basically a question mark as to whether they will get an appropriations bill done for THUD. The Senate passed this week another of these mini buses, so they're doing it in packages of 3 or 4 at a time. They passed one this week that was, I think it was Defense, Labor, and Health and Human Services. They included in that a continuing resolution for basically the way they wrote it is any agency that's not funded by the October 1 start of the fiscal year gets funded by continuing resolution through December 7th. They are trying to negotiate, or they're negotiating still, the House and Senate, on the remaining bills, including THUD. It looks like they're pretty well done with THUD. Jack Reed, who's the ranking member, said they were basically done with THUD, but there's some sticking points on some of the other bills that are part of that. Interior is one, and there's some environmental things in the House bill that is a sticking point. Sorry, we've got a little banging in the background. So there's some sticking points on non-THUD bills that are kind of holding up an agreement on THUD as well. They may be able to break through that. They're going to keep negotiating through the weekend. So we should know by next week whether there's going to be a THUD bill, and in which case we would know what the funding level is, whether it was 56 million, 45 million, or somewhere in the middle. Or if it's a continuing resolution and they punt until December, and we have a little more time to keep working on it. So that's kind of where things stand. We've been doing a lot of outreach. So the 4 main players right now are Mario Diaz-Balart and David Price, who are the chair and ranking member in the House, and Susan Collins and Jack Reed in the Senate. We did sign-on letters to Diaz-Balart, and just this morning, we have submitted one to Senator Reed and are going to get the one out to Senator Collins shortly. so that's kind of where things stand. Bruce, do you want to add anything?
Well, just a big shout out to the South Florida groups. We had 15 groups all sign. I know some of them made calls directly to Chairperson Diaz-Balart. He's the head of the THUD subcommittee, so probably the key negotiating person of the four, because he's the one who could champion the $56 million and say it's most important for him. And great job there. The main groups have scrambled up very, very quickly on short notice, and reaching out to Susan Collins. We have a key person in Rhode Island who is doing, who knows Reed well and is going to see him, what would it be, tonight, but also made calls. And then North Carolina, I think they've always been very supportive. So, I mean, it's been a mad scramble. We've also reached out to David Young in Iowa, so really trying to make this all come through. But, you know, this is the kind of nerve-wracking moment where you just it's all behind the scene. We don't know what's going on. Oh, and in 2020, fiscal year 2020 budget?
So, I mean, we had talked about, I think on the last call, we had talked about doing our big sign-on letter that we ordinarily do, I think, late winter, doing in the fall. Bruce can better explain because I was out of the office, but I think the short of it is that we're going to hold off on that for now. And so more to come on 2020. Do you want to elaborate, Bruce?
Oh, yeah, I just didn't want to blur the lines when we were in the major scramble on 2019. But the idea is we'll get a sign-on letter, and it'll go to HUD. Usually these had gone to OMB in the past, but I guess it's no big secret to think OMB may be not as sympathetic as had been in previous administrations. So that's where Mick Mulvaney is. And so our analysis is probably we're more effective at HUD, and we'll get that in. And then, of course, we'll do more in the spring when after the president's budget has come out that it moves in Congress.
That's all I've got for funding.
Good. Okay. Well, let's move on to disaster recovery and disaster preparedness. We have, we'll start with Christopher Hudak. Many of you may know him as a NABWorks trainer, and he's doing a lot of work with RCAC these days. He's an emergency management specialist, but has done a lot of work in terms of what agencies need to be thinking about in terms of preparedness. So, Christopher, are you with us?
I am with you. Can you hear me?
Great, yes. So,
okay,
slides up and ready to go.
All right. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Matthew, for having me. I want to say good morning to those of you in the West and West Coast, and good afternoon to those of you in the Midwest and East Coast. What I want to briefly get into here is some of the things that agencies can do to become more disaster resilient. Resiliency is a word that's kind of tossed around a lot these days. Essentially what it means is to be able to bounce back quicker. It doesn't mean that an agency or a town, city, country can resist a disaster. So just want to quickly open this up. Just many of you have seen this who have flown before. What does this image relay to you the most? And is there chat open right now, Bruce? And
it's not. No, we've got over 70 people on the line. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to open it then. Well, so essentially, help yourselves before putting the oxygen mask on your son or perhaps even your client. So you can go on to the next slide. So why are disasters important for housing counseling? So most importantly, it can substantially change how a housing counseling agency is able to carry out its HUD work plan. So first, there may be physical damage to the office. It may be inaccessible, say with Hurricane Florence right now, there could be flooding, the roof could be off of the office, your workers could potentially not be able to get to the office, and they themselves may lack in shelter, food, transportation. So your staff capacity could be seriously impacted. Then your clients may be disaster survivors themselves, and they may have compounding services needs. So they may have old needs. So say, for example, you're working with someone with financial capabilities needs. They may be working through budgeting or credit issues, and now they may not have a source of income because they may be unemployed because their source of employment has been wiped out by a natural hazard or even a human-caused hazard. So we can go on to the next slide. So what can a housing counseling agency do? There are 6 steps that you can do, and this is primarily drawn from HUD's guidance on HUD's exchange. So the first would be to create an emergency response plan, and I'll talk about the difference between an emergency response plan and what's next is a continuity of operations plan in the next couple of slides. And then the third would be to promote staff readiness with an emergency response and COOP plan training. So what that means is maybe biannually train folks in your office on the plan, update plan, or maybe even quarterly having drills, especially if you were in Hurricane Alley on the East Coast. What do you do when there's evacuation orders? What do you do when there's maybe a tropical storm that may not even be a hurricane yet? What is the protocol that your agency would follow? So you can go on to the next slide. So the next step would be to understand key disaster response and recovery resources. I want to make a distinction between response and recovery, but I also have a couple of caveats. So the response is what you see that's happening right now in North and South Carolina. When the first responders, FEMA search and rescue teams, fire, police, the Cajun Navy are out rescuing and helping folks. When the first responders go home, traditionally that's when the response phase would be considered over. But if you look at an example like Puerto Rico with hurricanes Irma and Maria, the response phase has blended into the recovery phase. And the reason why is normally in a response phase, FEMA gives people whose roofs were ripped off their houses, they give them tarps, blue tarps. So that's called blue roofing. And then in the recovery phase, that's when more like structural repairs would happen, like rebuilding the electrical grid. So in Puerto Rico, we see those two things overlapping each other. You see blue roofing happen, you see rebuilding of the electrical grid happening at the same time. So knowing the different types of resources for each of those phases of disaster cycle is important, but knowing how to distinguish is also important too. So the resources are going to be different. So disaster response, you're going to have first responders, you're still going to have FEMA, you're going to have Red Cross and like Salvation Army, volunteers active in disasters, etc. Recovery resources, you'll see Small Business Association, FEMA. You'll also see HUD with the CDBG DR funding, so the Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery funding resources in the recovery phases. We'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides. And then engage with your emergency management partners. So that would be your local emergency management office, your state emergency management office, FEMA, fire, and police. And then identify and create the pre and post disaster housing counseling services. So that would mean using traditional housing counseling services like pre and post purchase foreclosure intervention. That would be your traditional services and thinking about how you would plug in new disaster recovery type services into those existing services, and then creating new services that we'll have a discussion about that were created after, say, like Hurricane Katrina or after Hurricane Sandy. So you can go on to the next slide. So this is a great toolkit that just came out. I had a hand in helping create this for the HUD Office of Housing Counseling. Within this web page, you will find information about creating an emergency response plan, as well as creating a continuity of operations plan. That being said, it's not a easy to follow step-by-step template, and I believe that more work will be done on this in the future to create something that is much more usable for housing counseling agencies. Right now, this gives you the information, points you in the right direction, but it doesn't give you a step-by-step detailed process that is specific for housing counseling agencies. But I encourage you all to go to this website to see how you can prepare with that emergency response plan, and then how you can operate post-disaster with the continuity of operations plan. So next slide, please. So this emergency response plan guidance is from ready.gov. I would highly recommend this to housing counseling agencies. If you look here, there's tabs at the top of this web page. There's Be Informed and Plan Ahead. So this not only has information on how to create emergency response plans, it has information on how to respond to specific hazards. So I want to make the distinction that there are natural hazards like hurricanes and tornadoes and severe weather and wildfires. And then there's human-caused hazards such as an active shooter, bomb threats, terrorism, cyber warfare. These are hazards that your agency should be aware of. I would like to encourage you to avoid using the term natural disaster. You hear it all over the news. It's really not a real term. What's only a natural disaster is essentially when a natural hazard comes into contact with civilization. There's natural hazards all over our dynamic planet. However, a lot of them don't get recorded because they're not interfacing with human civilizations. So emergency response plan, this is a great plan, but this business plan is much more detailed than what a housing counseling agency would need. So next slide, please. So let's look at the difference between an emergency response plan versus a continuity of operations plan. The emergency response plan is activated immediately when the disaster strikes. So that would be could be a shooter in your office, it could be an earthquake, it could be a hurricane. Its main concern is with life safety and anything associated with that. So that would be evacuations plans, that would be sheltering in place, that would be a protocol for how to contact staff, first responders, etc. The COOP, by contrast, is activated after the disaster happens, after the first responders come, and the overall aim is to make sure that the agency can start up its operations again. And the emergency response plan defines, designs, and coordinates immediate responses to those hazards or threats. So as I said, shelter in place, evacuate, etc. And then the COOP ensures that the agency can actually function. And then the emergency response plan would determine the safety of the facility. So say, for example, in North Carolina, after Florence, maybe an operations director would go out and take a look at the facility and see if it's usable after flooding or hurricane force winds. And then that determination of safety of facility would be communicated to the executive director, who then puts into action the continuation of operations plans. And then finally on the COOP, its idea is to quickly resume full level of normal operations. So next slide, please. So this is really important for all the housing counseling agencies. This is a part of your HUD Housing Counseling Handbook. So this is the HUD approved Housing Counseling Agency inactive status. So this is taken for verbatim from the manual. It states some of the conditions under which inactive status may be considered include but are not limited to, and item 2 under this is damage to facilities by natural disasters that renders an agency unable to function properly. So you would need to notify your HUD POC, point of contact, if you are unable to continue your operations as part of your HUD work plan. So you can find that in your HUD Housing Counseling Manual, pages 62 to 63. So I'm going to hold that up there for a second so you can write that down. It's really important that this is a part of your emergency response plan as well as continuity of operations plan. Now, I want to recommend this as far as these plans go. RCAC, I've been working with RCAC, and a part of a webinar that we have done as well as a in-person class, we do a little more information about the emergency response plans and COOPs. I think that any housing counseling manager or director needs to be aware of these two types of plans. We're giving you a super brief overview here, but they're very important steps that you need to take for your agencies. So next slide, please. So let's look at the Community Development Block Grant DR, so disaster recovery. Some of you may already be familiar with this. This is essentially a congressional appropriation to assist disaster recovery and presidentially declared disaster areas. The process for this happening usually happens after FEMA has designated, has reviewed the areas after the presidentially declared disaster areas, or the president declares certain areas disasters. And then it goes to Congress where there is an appropriation that happens, goes back to FEMA and then to HUD. And this is like super brief overview, but it has to occur within the presidentially declared disaster areas. The grantees can implement various services and recovery activities. However, the grantees are normally states, local, or tribal governments. It's really important to know that housing counseling agencies cannot apply directly to these funds. So next slide, please. So what's important is to know is that the CDBG DR funding permits several different types of public services to be funded within their grants. The first is housing counseling. Second, of course, tenant-based rental assistance, time-limited mortgage assistance, and homeless prevention funds. These public services would be written into an action plan that is essentially the application that a state, local, or tribal government gives to HUD for the CDBG DR funding announcement. Next slide, please. So what's kind of new for this funding round that just was released, I believe it was the initial announcement was in January. Bruce, you can correct me if I'm wrong around that. Was that January on that?
I don't remember.
Okay, and so 15% of the CDBG DR grant can now be put towards the public services, and that's unless HUD provides a waiver for more of that funding to be provided towards the public services. So next slide, please. what I think is important, and this was part of a presentation that the HUD Office of Housing Counseling released, is that the the funding announcement had said that grantees are required to coordinate with HUD certified housing counseling organizations. In the past, they were encouraged but not required. It's not clear whether funding announcements in the future will have the requirement for housing counseling, but it seems it may. They also use certified housing counseling agencies when that's how the public law put that forth. They didn't use the appropriate HUD-approved counseling agencies. But I do want to say that it's a new change that we're seeing, and I think that it may be, well, who knows really, but it seems that they would continue to have the requirement in the funding announcement. And this funding announcement was for last year's hurricanes. This was for the 2000 season with Harvey, Irma, Maria, and I believe the California wildfires from last year were included in this funding announcement. I don't remember about that last one. You could forward the slide, please. Okay, so I do want to mention that this information was part of the material that I have been working on with RCAC. It won't be available for the participants on this call, but if you are interested in this information, you can attend one of RCAC's webinars on the topic or in the in-person class. We are teaching a class at the end of the month in Jacksonville. I do believe registration may be closed, but you can inquire with RCAC's training division to see if there's any more webinars or classes that they will be offering. Thank you, Bruce.
Good. Great. And just, I want to kind of emphasize this, getting into the involvement of the CDBG DR plan early on, so that counseling agencies really need to step up. If you're in a disaster area, you need to really be involved in that plan to really help design it in a way that allows you to do the best work you possibly can.
Bruce, may I mention,
Yeah.
so Bruce is going to be sending out a PDF from the Office of Housing Counseling on how housing counseling agencies can be involved with the CDBG DR action plans in your state and local area. I think what's most important about that is that you have a kind of like a marketing piece that says what you do and how it meets the needs for disaster survivors in your area, and meets the needs of disaster survivors in your area who are below a certain AMI that is required for the CDBG DR funding. So you can get some of that information from your HUD housing counseling NOFA. Usually in your needs section, you have to describe how you're meeting those needs and how there are those needs in your area. So I would say just, beg, borrow, and steal from that section of your grant application from the NOFA, and then polish it so that you are showing how you would meet the needs for disaster survivors below a certain AMI in the area.
And that checklist, the tips sheet, we sent out with the materials this morning that went out to the listserv. So if people can't put their fingers on it, let us know. We can post it again, but you should have it. So Matthew, any questions?
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly. First, with someone who who took the class and strongly recommends it to everyone, and then just going back quickly to the inactive status. Let me see if I can find the slide, but the question is basically about the time frame. They said, what is the time frame after a week, after a month? Could you just address that?
Yeah, there's no as far as I know, there's no time frame. Let me quickly double check my notes. I don't think that there is a time frame for. You should ask your HUD POC. I think it might be 2 weeks, but let me double check here. Give me 1 second here. I'm launching through my notes. So it doesn't say, it just says to submit a request in writing and that you may include documentation of the conditions that make your agency incapable of carrying out your HUD work plan. So I would look at the HUD Housing Counseling Manual, look at page 62 there. It doesn't seem like they're giving any specific time frame, but I would say if you're in an area that's been hit by a disaster, I would think it would be reasonable, like 2 weeks. It may be even a month, but I think that your POC would be accommodating in some way or another, but do check with them and check with the Office of Housing Counseling.
And when you're suspending, what is it functionally? What does that mean for your agency, that you don't get calls from that hotline? I mean, what doesn't happen as a result?
From my understanding is that you don't get calls, and you're not like I don't know what happens as far as funding goes, but it just suspends your HUD Housing Counseling work plan. Okay. And there's no guidance. It doesn't really say in the HUD Housing Counseling Manual about inactive status. So I just happened to be geeking out and looking through the HUD Housing Counseling Manual and saw this and was like, oh, disasters are a part of this. This is something that's kind of buried. I do think we need a little more guidance from the Office of Housing Counseling on timing and then what it actually means for funding, and then how it works with the work plan, and then what it means for restarting. Because I do know that they would need to notify the HUD POC that they are able to do the work plan, but I don't know what the process is. It would probably be in writing, but I don't know how long it takes to be reinstated.
And I'll just jump in. Teresa Bardwell from RCAC said that if you're inactive, then you won't be funded until you're active again, is
okay.
Part of the practical implications of it.
Thank you, Teresa.
Which means you have to pay your rent and stuff like that too, so that's a complicated problem.
Yeah, and I think that's why the emergency response plans and the COOP plans are so important, because you have to look at how you're going to pay your rent, how you're going to file insurance claims, and then how you're going to repair and recover the facility, or maybe have plans to move to an alternate facility. So all of that is wrapped up with your budgeting, with your HUD Housing Counseling Plan, and your funding stream. So it's a really important. There are two really important documents, and then steps that you would follow based on those documents, and also the like reinstatement of your HUD work plan.
Great. That's all for questions. I will, just before we switch over to Joseph, just reiterate that these slides were developed as part of a training that Christopher does with RCAC. We're not going to circulate them, but Christopher, will you just once again let folks know how they can participate in the trainings and get the slides that way?
Sure. If you go to RCAC's website, there are links to two of the trainings. There's a webinar, and there was the in-person class that will be happening in Jacksonville in about a week. I believe that the Jacksonville class, the registration is closed now. There's, as far as I know, there's no plans to have another webinar through RCAC, but if there's enough interest, perhaps RCAC will have another one of these webinars, but you can talk to their training division.
Good. And do you happen to know if the webinar was recorded?
Yes, I believe it was recorded, and those who participated in the webinar did receive a PDF of the slides.
I'm wondering if that might be an alternative if they don't have more lined up, but all good. Okay, thanks so much, Christopher. Stay on. We may have more discussion at the end, but let's line up Joseph Sant.
Great, thank you.
From the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. He's the Deputy General Counsel there, and we've had the center on before on a range of issues, but also on disaster issues and some of the discussions there. Joseph, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay, good.
So
well, I know you. Go ahead.
I'll just I'll dive in. Thank you for the introduction, Bruce, and for having me and the center on the call. I think I'm going to pick up a little bit following up on a lot of what Christopher introduced, which is great. I think I would consider my slides to be, once you've got the oxygen mask on yourself, now how do you go out and build programs and start counseling clients? So my materials are going to focus on some of the programs that we developed after Superstorm Sandy hit the Northeast in October 2012, and focusing on how housing counselors contributed to these programs, which focused on recovery and resiliency. Talk about how we structured and designed those programs and the involvement of counselors, and share some of our lessons learned about the impact of housing counselors in disaster recovery and resiliency programming, and just talk a bit about some of the possibilities that we think are worth considering for groups that are looking at their involvement in disaster housing counseling. So I'm going to talk a lot about recovery and resiliency. I use pretty much the same definition of recovery that Christopher introduced, which focuses on sort of after the first responders have come and gone, how do we restore homeowners to housing normalcy? How do we get the structures and finances kind of back on track so that people have stability and housing normalcy in their lives? And then when I talk about resiliency, I know that has many definitions, but our resiliency programming focuses on helping homeowners understand the risk of future damage, negative financial impacts of rising flood risk, and how to plan and retrofit and organize their finances accordingly. So we can go to the next slide. So if you don't know about my organization, we're a nonprofit that is devoted to promoting and protecting affordable homeownership in New York. And we're not only a intermediary that funds and supports housing counseling groups, although we're not an official HUD intermediary. We provide funding to a network of New York City housing counseling and legal services providers, and have over 30 partners that we support. We're also ourselves a HUD certified local housing counseling agency, and we provide some wraparound services that supplement the work of our network. And for purposes of today, we've also been heavily involved in program administration and design for housing recovery and resiliency in the last 5 years, and building partnerships that span the involvement of local government, state and city government, and integrating the work of housing counselors as well as our legal services partners into housing counseling. Into housing recovery. So I'm going to talk about the work we've done on a couple of specific programs, and on the next slide, those are introduced. So the two programs I wanted to share about are, one is our Build It Back counseling program, and this is a CDBG-DR funded program, and it provides legal services and housing counseling to facilitate housing recovery, and I'll give you more detail about that. But the and I am using the present tense because we are still implementing these programs. We're about over 90% done with recovery projects in New York City, but there are still some important reconstruction and elevation projects going on. And the second program I'll talk about is Flood Help New York, which is I would say focuses squarely on resiliency. And this is a program we've worked with the state government, Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, and it's focused on preparing homeowners for rising flood insurance and future storms, and thinking about, really focused on preparedness and how to get ready for rising flood risk. So on the next slide, these are some of the roles that housing counselors in our programs have played. And counselors are utility players for certain, and these are some of the ways in which they've really made an impact. So first, just being place-based advocates that can acquire knowledge of disaster recovery benefits programs. So immediately after Sandy, many of the groups that we work with responded by helping a lot of clients understand what disaster recovery benefits were out there and help them apply for them. So things like FEMA individual household assistance, filing homeowners insurance claims, filing flood insurance claims, applying for small business administration loans. Counselors kind of naturally adapted their skills to help homeowners in these areas. And that became important later on as we talk about the CDBG programs. When those came online, counselors who kind of made that initial investment to help in this area were really well suited to get integrated into the bigger DR programs that came along later in the recovery. Another important area is mortgage relief and foreclosure prevention. So after a disaster, particularly after a flood, but really in any disaster, the mortgage servicer is the focal point of a lot of benefits. A lot of benefits have to flow through the mortgage servicing company, including insurance, flood insurance, and mortgage servicers also, depending on the investor, offer now a lot of disaster relief options. So there are moratoria on foreclosure that many servicers will need to implement after a presidentially declared disaster. There are special forbearance and load modification options. And as I mentioned, the servicer is the distributor of insurance proceeds after a disaster. So if the homeowner files a claim for insurance and there is a payout, that goes through your mortgage servicer. And housing counselors have really helped homeowners navigate those processes, which can be very complicated and need advocacy. Counselors are also good recovery pathway advisors. Homeowners are, after a disaster, are evaluating a lot of different potential ways of responding after a storm. How should they be using their insurance proceeds? How should they be using their federal or locally distributed funding to help them recover? Avoiding contractor scams when they decide to go ahead and do rehab work, and also evaluating bigger picture questions such as, should I even be looking at rebuilding, or should I be pursuing perhaps a buyout or acquisition, and how do I evaluate between those options and make a decision? So counselors are really well equipped, can become very well equipped to help clients with those questions. Long-term resiliency advisors. So resiliency that I'm talking about here includes considering the rising cost of flood insurance, the rising flood risk that coastal homeowners are facing, and retrofitting for flood risk. And how do homeowners finance those improvements, and does it make financial sense for them to do so? These are all really kind of squarely in the counselor tool set with some adaptations. policy feedback. Counselors are great at delivering on-the-ground understanding about how local disaster recovery programs are functioning or not, and suggesting ways to improve the responsiveness of disaster recovery programs. Every program that's funded by CDBG-DR is built from scratch by local or state government, and having counselors provide this continuous feedback is a great way to counteract kind of the natural bureaucracy that comes through structuring a large, complicated federal program. And finally, outreach. This is a really important value that counselors add, particularly to, again, to CDBG-DR programs, which really need to focus on meeting the needs of LMI homeowners and have and are accountable to HUD for primarily benefiting low, moderate income households. The ability of counseling groups to do outreach, to engage hard-to-reach populations, to overcome kind of distrust of government is really critical and makes them a natural partner to large-scale disaster recovery programs. So those are some of the general roles, and I'll talk about how those got applied in a couple of specific programs on the next couple slides. So the first is Build It Back. I mentioned Build It Back is New York City's flagship housing recovery program. It was created, again, using CDBG-DR funding. And I'm going to talk mostly about the small homes component. So through the small homes component of Build It Back, over 8,000 homeowners have been assisted. Just over 1,300 received a total rebuild or a home elevation, which is being depicted here in this picture. 6,600 moderate repairs and reimbursements, and there's also an acquisition component that served, I think at this point, a couple hundred, done a couple hundred buyouts of storm damaged properties. So the next slide. So the counseling program that we created was a component of the overall Build It Back program, and we built it in partnership with New York City, the HUD grantee for CDBG. So this program integrates housing, counseling, and legal services assistance into the program, and it has provided counseling to over 4,000 households, and many households come back for multiple reasons. So we have over 7,500 cases since 2013. So to build this program, we partnered with a subset of our housing counseling groups and legal services partners in New York City. So we started with 7 groups, and we launched this program and selected partners based on who was already on the ground doing disaster recovery. You know, the DR program, the CDBG programs take a few months to get off the ground after a disaster. Build It Back started to launch probably about a year out after the actual storm event. So by that time, we had seen kind of which groups had made an investment in disaster recovery and were building their capacity to deliver this type of assistance, and we brought them into this program. So the group started with a narrow role. Originally, we thought counselors were going to focus mostly on mortgage delinquency and foreclosure, but as the recovery went on, we really kind of saw how useful the counselor skill set and the professional mindset of counselors as advocates could be adapted. And so they ended up taking on a much bigger role, including just helping homeowners understand the Build It Back program, complete sometimes really complicated or burdensome paperwork, and decide between multiple pathways. And eventually what counselors came to do a lot of is help homeowners who disagreed with a decision or needed to make an appeal of a program decision. So they kind of carried out this advocacy and educational function. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you kind of the partnership structure. So the New York City Office of Housing Recovery Operations was the, New York City is the grantee from HUD, and then New York City had an agreement with the center to provide counseling services, and we brought in a number of groups as subcontractors. And these groups, again, were the groups that had we already knew they were on the ground doing this work and could easily be adapted into this program. So the next slide is about our other program, Flood Help NY. So this is a resiliency program. So whereas Build It Back is about restoring housing normalcy, Flood Help NY is about coping with rising flood risk and getting ready for the next storm event. So the way we deliver this program, we have a qualified engineering firm visit the home and assess the home for flood risk and identify ways in which the building could be retrofitted to both lower flood risk and, importantly, to lower or head off rising flood insurance costs. And that's very important in our coastal neighborhoods, and I imagine is an issue that will begin to be salient in recently affected areas as well. But because of changes in the federal flood insurance program, a lot of coastal homeowners here are staring down cost increases of over $10,000 a year or more on their flood insurance premium. And so there are a few ways you can cope with that, but this is a program that is squarely taking aim at sort of that threat. So after not only do the engineers assess flood risk, they also provide an elevation certificate for the homeowner, and that's necessary in order to qualify for accurate flood insurance. We prepare write up these results from the engineer and surveyor doing the elevation certificate, turn it into a customized resiliency plan. And here's where the counselor comes in. They tie together the findings that the building engineer and the surveyor determined would help the homeowner become more resilient and what might impact their flood insurance rates. And that is all tied together with the session with between a resiliency counselor and the homeowner. So,
Joseph, can I just ask a quick question here? So
sure.
Did CDBG-DR pay for the engineering and the elevation work?
Yes. Yeah, actually, this is another CDBG-DR funded program. It's a public service program. So it's comprehensive of the engineering and the counseling services. So a new thing we're adding to this program is that certain homeowners will actually qualify for a retrofit. One of the retrofits we're adding is a backwater valve, which helps prevent nuisance flooding and sewer backup, which is affecting a lot of coastal homeowners. So we're kind of going from a educational program to let people know about flood risk and pushing in the direction of helping people actually take action and improve the resiliency of their homes. So the next slide here. So this is a much more complicated partnership structure, but here's the way it works. New York State Governor's Office of Storm Recovery is the HUD grantee, and we are what's called a subrecipient to the state. And then we brought together all of these different partners. So we have legal partners, housing counseling partners, engineers, and then we also have a web platform that we launched to help with the consumer education and the sign-up process. So all these are brought together under one program. And the way housing counseling got involved is their role is not just to be that have that tie-in role and to educate the homeowner, but they also are critical on outreach. And over half of our program participants sign up for this program because they were at a outreach event hosted by a housing counseling agency. And it's really critical, we found, to have counselors do those presentations especially on a topic around risk and preventative measures, because you really need to make the case to the homeowner, why should I be taking action now? What's the urgency? And counselors are great at delivering that message, and that encourages signups. So just a couple more things that I wanted to touch on the next slide is about when to get involved. So Bruce and Christopher, we both touched on this, but it's really important that if groups want to get involved in disaster recovery, that they know when and how to step in and start to help when designing the programs. So here's kind of a quick and rough flow of how CDBG-DR programs come to get built. And it's really important, particularly at the action plan phase. That's when local government and HUD are really writing the playbook about how the program that they're going to use CDBG-DR funds to implement. What does it look like? What does it include? And what is the specific role of housing counseling, if any? So that's a really important time to get involved. When the New York City action plan was being drafted, we got together with a coalition of our housing counseling partners and legal services providers and drafted recommendations to city government and met with them. And that really positively, I think, influenced the shape of the action plan and made it possible for us to build the counseling programs and have them really be deeply integrated into recovery, as opposed to kind of just having a surface level coordination. So I think that's really important to emphasize. And then after that, presumably there are, once the action plan is set up, there are typically requests for proposals that go out, and so that's when the rubber really hits the road and you come back with proposals. So I just have a few lessons to recap. So some of the things we've really kind of tried to distill and learn from. Counselors in recovery programs have been really critical at reducing drop-off. So, it's 5 years since Hurricane Sandy, and some people are still going through the rebuild and reconstruction process. And what we've found through some studies that we've worked with the city is that whereas if you didn't work with a counselor, you had about a 1 in 2 chance of just quitting the recovery program. If you worked with a counselor, that got cut to about 1 in 4. So really dramatic effect. There's a lot of reasons why I think that is the case. I think having an expert on your side combats the fatigue that the homeowner starts to encounter with these really bureaucratic programs. And it helps make sure that programs work for you. And having an expert on your side is really critical. So next, counselors improve program policies. And I mentioned this earlier, but when you're deeply integrated into these recovery programs and you have a seat at the table, you're viewed as on the team, you can have a really positive impact on improving program policies. As I said, all these DR programs are built from scratch after a disaster, and people are kind of figuring out as they go along. So being that on the ground presence that can continuously provide feedback is, I think, a really great way to leverage counseling. And one of the things we've learned from our flood help programs is the way in which integrating the engineering and the building experts has enhanced counseling. So the way it works in Flood Help NY, engineers go out and look at the structure and provide an expert assessment of what needs to happen to that building. The reason that's so effective is that those are the questions and the concerns that homeowners present to us when they meet with us in these counseling offices. And if we can't answer the brick and mortar questions about what to do to the structure, it's very hard to get to the important discussion of rising flood insurance and other types of important preparedness discussions. So being able to integrate that building expertise has been a real enhancement. And the last lesson is I hit on this a couple of times, but getting involved in disaster response and recovery early on can lead to longer-term opportunities to get involved. So it was the case, but we're working in both of these programs with groups that made a decision early on in the recovery process to build a disaster recovery practice. And we're still leveraging those groups. And that, I think that you can contrast that with groups that maybe decided to dip their toes in and maybe devote half of a staff person, and they kind of sloughed off in the recovery process pretty quickly. But those that made a really that dove in were in a good position, especially with CDBG-DR programs as they came up a year and a half later. So I'll close there, and I guess we'll see if there's questions.
So let's take another 10 minutes if people can hang on. We're at the hour already. Let me ask just a quick question: do you have it documented anywhere in writing that about the value of the counselors and the fact that people stayed in the program and saw it through, and that they had resolutions are better? That would be helpful for us to have.
There's a study that's going to come out soon, hopefully next month. It's going to be put out by the City University of New York. So it's not out yet, but the draft, we've reviewed the drafts. So as soon as that's out, we'll make sure to share that around with you.
Good. Sounds good. Matthew, are there any questions in the pipeline?
There are not. Just to kind of double back to the previous presentation, there had been some questions about whether there would be another webinar, the RCAC webinar that Christopher had done. And RCAC let us know that they plan to do another class. And first, that it was recorded, but that's not publicly available. And they do plan on doing another webinar and another class in 2019, but just need to wait for funding to kind of shake out before they know for a fact and have any details. So folks should just keep an eye out for that.
Great. Well, excellent. So thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Christopher. We'll close on that note. Very helpful. Thanks so much, everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Great.